Welcome along. So we all know that Labour's new Foreign Secretary thinks the soon-to-be President of the United States is a KKK white supremacist sympathising misogynist. But if Trump's VP pick, JD Vance, is anything to go by, it looks like the Americans don't think very highly of Labour either.
What is the first truly Islamist country that will get a nuclear weapon? And we were like, maybe it's Iran. You know, maybe Pakistan already kind of counts. And then we sort of finally decided maybe it's actually the UK, since Labour just took over.
Well, Labour did their best to hit back today.
Well, I don't think anyone here in Britain would recognise that caricature. Look, politics is,
isn't it?
Well, politics is controversial. You know, President Trump is controversial. It should be no surprise he's picked somebody who's also controversial as a running mate. Look, in the end, who the American people elect to be their president and vice president is for them.
Well, I suppose somebody could point out that Labour MPs have been happy to go on pro-Palestine marches alongside some people who have actually supported Islamists, or that Sir Keir Starmer thought Shamima Begum should be allowed back to Britain, or that Sir Keir Starmer did give legal advice to a now-banned terrorist group. But luckily for the Labour leader, the Conservatives have decided to also distance themselves from the soon-to-be Vice President of America's comments.
I disagree fundamentally with a lot of what the Labour Party stand for and what they're going to do in government, but I disagree fundamentally with the comments by JD Vance. That's not to say that we won't work very closely with him and indeed President Trump, should he be re-elected.
Well, JD Vance's comments tell us that our special relationship is going to be very difficult between the Trump and Starmer administrations, but I think it also tells us something else. Our greatest ally can see that we have a massive problem with the unchecked rise of Islamism, and they worry that the new Labour government won't take that problem seriously enough. Let's get our thoughts from our panel tonight. Columnist and broadcaster Esther Kraku joins us alongside senior political correspondent at the Daily Express, it's Christian Cowgie, and author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. Christian, do you think we have a right to be worried about the threat of Islamism under a Labour government, whether they quite recognise it or take it seriously enough?
I think we have a right to be alert to the threats, regardless of the political rosettes of the government. We've been rightly worried about what's been happening over the last few years under the Conservative government, and I think there have clearly been failures of integration in certain cities, and Labour bore the brunt of that on election night with those astonishing and incredibly surprising defeats, including of a member of the Shadow Cabinet, Jonathan Ashworth, in Leicester. So they, I'm hoping, will be alert to the threats here, but there clearly needs to be a response, and we can't brush it under the rug. And that's not to say that Muslims don't have a right to be vocally aggrieved about what is happening in Gaza, as many non-Muslims are. But I am concerned about sectarian voting, as has been highlighted by Nigel Farage and others. And we've seen some other countries in Europe that have addressed this, that are perceived as liberal countries, that have looked at who can move into certain areas to try and get those demographic balances more representative and counterbalanced out.
I do wonder, you know, all right, OK, so he was kind of jokey there, Esther, but I mean, is that really a bit of the way that our closest ally kind of views us? Do we think that we might be a bit of a soft touch when it comes to Islamism?
Well, it was a bit of a shameless jab, but there is an element of truth there. Fortunately or unfortunately, the Americans can say what they like because they're more important to us than we are to them, quite frankly. Look, the UK does have a problem with Islamism, and as we've seen recently, it has a problem with increasingly sectarian voting because of this whole Israel-Gaza conflict. I'm not sure whether he was talking specifically about Gaza and what we've seen in the recent election, or Islamism and sort of its link to, obviously, sort of homegrown terrorism, which the UK...
It's probably a bit of all of it.
Well, I think he's a very learned man, so I suspect it was both, which the UK has still struggled to deal with. We've struggled to tackle, you know, groups self-isolating and the increasing rise of extremism, particularly Islamist extremism in these sort of communities that live parallel lives to the rest of us. And that is very true. Now, to the extent that that would widely influence politics in the UK on a national level, of course, is not quite significant. It's more about making our lives a living hell and not knowing who your neighbour is or whether they want to set you up for being, blow you up for being an infidel, which, again, is a very valid point. I do think it's in bad taste, though, because that's not exactly how you want to start off your relationship.
No, it's not. I mean, that guy, Amy, obviously does not care about the fact that he's about to be, as all things stand at the moment, Vice President. We've got a Labour government here, and he's making quips about whether or not the Labour government is going to turn us into the first nuclear-armed Islamist state. I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing to say, but again, I think it comes down to that question of perception, doesn't it? And, this may or may not be unfair, right? The idea that Keir Starmer was seen as being a bit soft when it came to people like Shamima Begum, or whether Labour MPs out there, marching with pro-Palestine individuals, some of whom have had placards that we said, I fully support Hamas and things like that. Whether there is that perception across the Atlantic there that Labour is softer when it comes to Islamist terrorism.
I think you're really overemphasising how much Americans know or care about what's going on here in the UK.
There's that.
Honestly, I reckon he was at the National Conservatism thing in Washington. He'd been chatting away to Suella, maybe Liz Truss. They told him a few things about, no-go zones that they just kind of made up. And then he was like, hey, I'll say something that will tune with the British members of the audience who are here at the National Conservative Convention. So that would suggest that they would like what he's saying and he'd get a bit of a round of applause. And I think it just goes as deep as that, honestly.
Be that as it may, though, it stings because it's kind of true. The elements of it, that's true. This is the thing. It wasn't like, everyone in Britain has red hair. It was, Islamism in Britain is a threat that we are taking notice about in the US. The extent to which he's actually knowledgeable about domestic British politics, I agree with you. It could be quite sketchy because he's not British. That being said, though, the reason why it's made headlines and the reason why people are saying ouch is because we do have a problem with it. We've not tackled since the late 1990s when people like Trevor Phillips were talking about, groups, communities self-isolating, people living in this country for decades not even speaking English, people, homegrown terrorists because people can literally live in enclaves where they're being indoctrinated with these toxic views to hate Britain and the people who inhabit it. We haven't grappled with that, and it's just getting worse and worse.
OK, but equally, you can't just focus on that side of extremism. You also have to talk about right-wing extremism, which is very much a threat as well.
It's not even 1% the size of the threat of Islamist terrorism in this country. That's a complete fallacy. I mean, it is.
Well, I think it's also a complete fallacy saying that it was integration that caused people to not vote for the Labour Party in the recent election, that Jonathan Ashworth lost his seat because of integration. No, he didn't. He lost his seat because of terrible Labour communications over the issue of Gaza.
But also
hold on,
very fraudulent and lies about him put out by someone who is
ironically
now in trouble with the police.
Ironically, I think JD Vance may have done our own Foreign Secretary David Lammy quite a helpful job here, right? Because now they've both made indiscreet, offensive, undiplomatic comments about relative, him about Britain and our own Foreign Secretary about Donald Trump. So maybe that's his bargaining card, which is we'll forget what you said if you'll forget what I repeatedly insulted Donald Trump on about.
He can say that because he's the second most powerful man of the most important country in the world. Britain is like a floating middle power.
Do you know what?
I
was so surprised when I was in the US a couple of weeks ago and I was watching US news that they didn't mention our general election once. We are very irrelevant to them. And I was asking people, do you know Rishi Sunak? Do you know Keir Starmer? They were more interested in the French election, you're right. And no one knew either of them, actually.
Well, we mean Rishi Sunak. Absolutely, yeah.
And one person...
Biden very much enjoyed his meeting with Rishi Sunak last week.
A US cab driver said to me, do you guys get to vote? Because he thought we had a monarchy and we were subjects.
No. And wouldn't that be bliss?
Well, we do have a monarchy, but you know what I mean.